Let me ask you a question. When you think of food chain, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it maybe some sort of animal or human food chain? Well, there are lots of different types of food chain. I had no idea there was different types of food chain until I learned about it in science. And today I'll be teaching you how the food chain that I learned. Let's start off with the bottom of the food chain, the primary producer. A primary producer is an organism that can produce its own food. Examples of this could be flowers or bacteria or a lot of the other stuff. Primary producers are at the bottom of the food chain, normally are very small. It could be, and things you see in your day-to-day life, such as grass, maybe flies, wheat, just all those type of stuff. And that's what a primary producer is, at the bottom. And then next up we have a primary consumer. Primary consumers are animals that you've probably seen before. They tend to be very small, or are mostly very small, such as maybe grasshoppers. Let's use the example of grass. Let's say grass was our primary producer, and let's say our primary consumer was grasshoppers. Grasshoppers would eat the grass and take the energy from the grass. They would not take all the energy because there would still be that they might not have ate all the grass. So let's say that the grasshopper is the primary consumer. They could also be flies or rabbits, or depending on what your primary producer is, you will see what your primary consumer is. Now let's see what's next up. Next up in the food chain is the secondary consumer. Let's use the example of grasshoppers again. Let's say grasshoppers get eaten by frogs. I'm not sure if they get eaten by frogs, but I think so. So, actually no, I don't think they do, so I'm going to say, let's say it's a mouse. So if the mouse eats the grasshopper, the mouse is a secondary consumer, because they eat the primary consumer. As you can, that's so showing that the mouse eats the grasshopper and takes the energy from the grasshopper. Cannot only be grasshoppers. Again, depending on what your primary consumer is or primary producer is, will decide what all the rest of the stuff in your food chain. So using the example of grasshopper, mouse would be the secondary consumer, but it doesn't even have to be mouse. There's lots of other things that could eat it. Now let's go finally, and also I'd like to mention some food chains don't have this last one, called the tertiary consumer. The tertiary consumer is usually the last one on the consumer list. The tertiary consumer, let's do the example of mouse. Say if the tertiary consumer was owls. Owls would eat the mice and take the energy from them. As you can see, it's kind of like a chain, and then it starts all over again when grass, it's not really a chain, but because grass obviously doesn't eat owls, that doesn't make any sense, but you can see everything connecting to each other. So, and again, it depends on what your the primary producer can make all the rest be different. Now, let's talk about the different the hierarchy of food chain. At the start we have domain, kingdom, cycle, class, order, family, genus, and species. This is pretty hard to remember, and if you don't remember it, it's okay, because I learned a little trick to make you remember it easier. Here it is. Dear King Philip came over for good soup. If you remember that line, or maybe write it down somewhere, you can see what it is. Even though you might not be able to read all of it, it stands for domain, dear, kingdom, king, which is pretty easy, cycle, Philip, came, class, over, order, for, family, good, genus, soup, which is species. And that's a very easy way to remember the hierarchy of these plants. But in conclusion, food chains are pretty amazing things. It's always good to see what animals or stuff can be in a food chain, and even though there's many examples of a food chain, hopefully you know the basics of what a food chain is. And bye.